Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Please continue to enjoy the lunch. We're going to get our panel underway. My name is Tim Carney. I'm a visiting fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm also a senior columnist at the Washington Examiner. Most of what I do here is crony capital. I guess most of what I do here is work on the issue of crony capitalism. But I'm also involved in AEI's project on human flourishing. And in this regard, it's trying to better understand how ideas that exist that we share, a lot of us here at AEI, about either limited government or conservatism and libertarianism and that whole world, how can they add to human flourishing? How can they get involved in the policy debate that circles around this? And one of the things that occurred to me in this regard was that the topic of the safety net seemed to be something that liberals spoke about more, just like healthcare was in the past. And as I thought about this, I realized that a lot of the best ideas I was hearing about the safety net these days, were coming on the right. So I think that it's a good question for conservatives, people who believe in limited government, to ask, how can the safety net be saved? There's obviously a premise in there that the safety net ought to be saved. We can discuss some of that. What we brought together was a panel of people who are experts on this topic, who have great ideas, and it's not accidental that I brought together all people who are basically on the right, because I think that there's a good topic, a good discussion to be had on this question where we start from some common premises, but we will disagree. They're all going to speak. We're going to have a discussion here, so get your questions ready as early as possible. We're going to want to hear from you and your questions as well. If you guys picked up, the bios are available at the front desk, so I'm going to give you abbreviated versions of the bios. We have here my AEI colleague, Robert Doar, is the Morgridge Fellow in Poverty Studies here. Before that, he was in the Bloomberg administration as Commissioner for New York City's Human Resources Administration, and before that, he worked as New York State's Commissioner of Social Services. We also have, also from AEI, Brad Wilcox, a visiting fellow here. He directs University of Virginia's National Marriage Project, and for his sins, he's an associate professor there, which means he has to depart early to drive down there for a faculty meeting. Also, we have right next to me Scott Winship. He's a Walter B. Wriston Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He was previously at the Brookings Institution. He's a contributor to Forbes and along with Brad Wilcox to the Room to Grow book project that the YG Network has been doing with collaboration with AEI. So I want to get started. Brad has been writing a lot about this. He has a presentation. So why don't you kick us off, Brad, and just sort of tell us what is the deal with the safety net and poverty?
Tim, thanks for that introduction. It's a great topic for us to address here today. And I want to begin, I think, appropriately enough with a quote from Arthur Brooks, our fearless leader here at AEI, who had this to say a little while ago on this general theme. I want to talk about two Americas. I want to tell you first, the poor are being left behind. Second, I want to tell you that conservatives are not trusted by the American people to engage this problem. And third, I want to tell you about a social justice agenda by conservatives to truly take on the poverty problem in America and redress the two Americas crisis. So I think Arthur here is right, and on three fronts. Ours is indeed a nation divided by education, economics, and marriage in many ways, increasing on many of those fronts. And this quote strikes at the heart of our predicament. And I think also the challenge facing conservatives, like all of us, who seek both to bridge this growing divide in America and also to renew the nation's faith in the American dream. I think the only thing that's missing from this particular comment here is a clear acknowledgement of the increasingly fragile predicament, not just of the poor in the U.S., but also of the working class. And the next slide gives you a sense of trends in income by quintile in 2010 dollars. And what it suggests to us is that at the bottom two quintiles, and to some extent at the third quintile, we've seen declines in income or a kind of stagnation to some extent in income. So my pointer simply is that there is at least some empirical evidence suggesting on the economic front that the American dream isn't doing obviously so well for poor and working class Americans. So as a reformed conservative, I would argue that public policy does have a role, albeit a modest one, in strengthening the institutions that can both bridge this growing class divide and also help to renew or make first accessible the American dream to poor and working class Americans. And that there are three really core institutions that are key if we're serious about bridging this growing divide in America and also making the American dream more accessible to Americans across the educational and income spectrum. One is to continue to work on ed reform. Two is to continue to make work more common and remunerative for people across the educational spectrum, and then also to look seriously at marriage and family life and strengthening marriage and strengthening families, particularly for working class and poor Americans. That these kinds of institutions have and today still play a key role in making the American dream possible for Americans throughout our country. But I think we also have to be cognizant as conservatives that public policies that are designed to strengthen these institutions or designed to help people, as all of us know, can have unintended consequences. And so as we kind of craft policies, try to be attentive to the ways in which our good intentions may go awry. And as we see problems with policies and with their rollout, that we're attentive to ways in which we need to reform them. That's part of our agenda as reformed conservatives. So in terms of the good and the bad here, I think in terms of the positive side of the ledger, we've seen some successes when it comes to ed reform in the growing popularity and success of some charter schools, like for instance the KIPP public charter schools have achieved in helping kids from lower income backgrounds flourish in our schools, which of course gives them a leg up as adults, in terms of realizing or accessing the American dream. We've also seen, and I think Robert probably could talk about this more as well, that welfare reform did achieve some major successes, both in terms of boosting single mothers' work and income and reducing poverty among single-parent families, particularly in the first few years in the wake of welfare reform. So these are some examples of the way in which good public policy can strengthen the fortunes of kids and adults from poor and working class communities. But I think it's also, clear that we haven't really achieved any major successes when it comes to strengthening marriage and family, at least from a kind of public policy perspective. So this is one area where I think it remains to be seen if there are strategies, if there are tactics that we can take that will address this core institution that is the family, that it's so closely connected to Americans' economic well-being. So just in terms of the quick show of the evidence, you can see here, this is from Ron Haskins, that in the wake of welfare reform, you can see that the share of single mothers who are working increases markedly, and that has obvious implications both for their earned income, their disposable income, and their rates of poverty. And Ron, kind of reflecting on the lessons of welfare reform, has this to say about kind of how we should think about public policy vis-a-vis the safety net. Quote, social policy should emphasize, and where necessary and possible, demand responsible behavior, personal behavior, and then reward that behavior. Okay, so it's about trying to align our policies with these core American institutions and the values that support them on things like education, work, and I'd also say family. But when you look at a different outcome here, you look at non-marital childbearing, from the 60s to the present, through both Democratic and Republican administrations, we don't see much evidence that public policy has had a major impact on what has until at least 2007 been a fairly linear increase in non-marital childbearing. And more particularly, I don't see any evidence that welfare reform did much to slow the growth in non-marital childbearing. Why is that? Why is it that we haven't seen major public policy successes when it comes to marriage and family? Well, I think one possibility here, and this is more a hypothesis than a firm conclusion, is that we actually haven't really gone to the major financial incentives or disincentives associated with many of our public policies targeting lower-income families. And what we see in the research on this is that many of our transfer policies end up unintentionally penalizing marriage. And that matters, given that the most recent census figures indicate that more than 109 million Americans are receiving some kind of means-tested benefits. So a huge share of our population has some connection to a means-tested benefit. And if those benefits are, unintentionally penalizing marriage, that may have some, discernible, some important effect on their thinking about sort of the advisability of marriage. So given all this, what I would just say by way of conclusion is conservative efforts to promote social justice should be attentive to the ways in which they either strengthen policies, that is, strengthen or undermine these three core institutions that have had such a major impact on people's ability to realize the American dream, that is education, work, and marriage. And when it comes to marriage, what I would say is that we need to be thinking about ways in which, at least from the public policy vantage point, we're not doing any harm. And more concretely, we need to think about ways in which we can work to reduce or eliminate the marriage penalties embedded in many of our transfer policies that affect literally millions and millions of Americans across the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. So my question for Robert Dorr, your time in New York, what worked?
Well, Tim, thanks for that question. I was going to say that one of the things that was important when we talk about how conservatives should talk about the safety net is the first thing is to get in the game. I had this lucky career in New York where I rose in the infrastructure of government pretty rapidly. And people would always say, well, how did that happen? And I would say, well, when Republicans are in charge, the line for jobs in social services is very short. So the competition was weak. And so I think that it's very important that the first thing that worked was that we, from right of center, in some contexts, and certainly both Governor Pataki and Mayor Bloomberg were strong supporters of personal responsibility and work-based welfare policies. One thing was that we paid attention to it, that we talked about it, that we got in the game, that we were engaged in solutions and in trying to address the problem in an affirmative way, rather than talk negatively about the whole infrastructure of any effort on the part of government to help the poor. And so that's the first thing. We were in the game and we were engaged in proposing solutions. The second thing is that we were hopeful, and not only hopeful about the opportunity, and this may be a little bit not quite conservative, but hopeful about the aspect that government could help solve the problem. We're also hopeful about the human resources and what we could expect from the people we were trying to help. So much of what comes from the left about people who are poor characterize them as victims, as powerless, as incapable of working or moving up or making decisions in a society that is not kind to them. Our attitude was different. Our attitude was the people that live in these communities have strengths, they have abilities, and nowhere was that better told in the extent to which single, never married mothers in the wake of welfare reform, people thought would never get into the workforce, went into the workforce in large numbers. And I saw that all the time. And the third thing was that we set expectations, that we weren't afraid to say to folks who were poor or struggling, we think you can bear some responsibilities for your livelihood, and we are going to treat you as someone who has agency and has a responsibility. Now, at the same time, we were also very open about our paternalism. We felt that in return for assistance, we are able to say, we need you to change certain behavior, and if you don't behave in a certain way, we're going to reduce your benefits, and we're going to send you a notice that says your case is closed, and we're going to make you go to another office and have that resolved by some effort on your part. So we set expectations, we were hopeful, we were in the game. We weren't talking about entitlements. We were talking about a reciprocal relationship between the government. You do something and we'll do something in return. The other thing is we were very data focused, and I always hold our great colleague Charles Murray, Losing Ground is a seminal work because it took all the data and showed how badly we had failed in addressing some problems that, despite great efforts and investment. We did the same thing in New York. We were constantly reporting against ourselves, against offices within the city. I used to have the welfare offices come on a monthly basis and say why their office got fewer people placed in jobs last month than a similarly sized office in the Bronx versus Brooklyn. Very competitive, very data focused, very, very useful in forcing people to improve. The other thing I would like to point out, just as sort of something that we, I think, learned with regard to the spending problem, is that we recognized, and this is harder for some to accept, that the spending problem in America is not about caseworkers in social services. The spending problem in America is about benefit issuances in large entitlement programs of dollars going out to people, checks being written directly to people or to healthcare industry. And so healthcare industry certainly gets a lot of money in welfare spending. But caseworkers in welfare offices and even government workers, it's a very small fraction. So when we were concerned about our spending, which we were, we didn't focus on an area that may sound, let's shrink that bureaucracy. That may sound great, but it really had no real substantive effect. We also acknowledged that, and this again, work at AEI and many others have shown, that the safety net works to alleviate material hardship all over our country. The poverty rate doesn't really work to show anything about material want or need because it doesn't count all that we do to support low-income Americans. And to the extent that this sort of the pictures of severe poverty that are conjured by the word poverty or by our historical notions of poverty just aren't equated with what the poverty measure shows, because we do provide as a country. We are an enormously generous country to low-income Americans, and we should be proud of that, and we should stand up for that because it does show how significantly different from other parts of the world than we are. On the other hand, this is the last thing, is that we can't ever allow those forms of assistance to substitute for work. And that's the big issue, because people can be materially well off so that you think that they have enough to support themselves and their family at a minimum existence that is not embarrassing to our country. But if they're not working and they're not earning that for themselves, then I don't think we've really accomplished as much as we'd like to. And so we always were focused on work being the ultimate objective. And then if work wasn't enough, and sometimes in some families it may not be enough, we were supportive of supporting work all the time. But the last thing I wanted to say is that I do feel really hopeful about the extent to which conservatives and people on the right are acknowledging their language problem and their attitude problem toward these issues and stepping up, partly due to the failure of the current administration to get our economy going so that people's livelihoods and earnings could grow, but also partly due to our own sense of citizenship. But the way we talk about it has to be about the failure of our government or our society to create an environment so that low-income Americans can thrive and prosper and to make the right choices about marriage and work. It can't be a language that sounds like it's their fault. And I only will say that I'm reminded that the thing I remember most from hearing from the Mitt Romney during the campaign was his constant echo. There's 46 million people on food stamps. And to me, that sounded like it's their fault that there's 46 million people. It's the 46 million people's fault. But it wasn't their fault. It was the fault of our government and our economy failing them so badly that they didn't have an environment where they could work their way so they didn't need food stamps. That was the fault. But whenever the emphasis was on the people on food stamps, it always sounded like it's their fault. And I think people heard it that way and reacted negatively to it.
Thanks, Robert. So, Scott, my question for you then is, Ronald Reagan said, "We fought a war on poverty, and poverty won." Was he right?
Well, thanks for the question, Tim, and thanks for the invitation to all you AEI folks for inviting me as well. So did we win or lose the war on poverty? I mean, I think there's a sense in which we actually did win the war on poverty in a very limited way. But ultimately, I think President Reagan was right. So we won the war on poverty in a sense because we actually did have the poverty rate if you measure it the right way. So measuring income and poverty trends is very complicated. I was going to say I endorse everything that Brad and Robert said before me, except for Brad's income trend chart. So if you take into account, as Robert said, kind of all of the benefits, including non-cash benefits like food stamps, housing subsidies, healthcare benefits, things like that. If you measure changes in the cost of living the right way, the best evidence suggests that we actually halved the poverty rate between 1964 and today. There were big drops, but the way that we did it was actually pretty problematic in a number of ways. So among the elderly, big declines in poverty. That's a story that's entirely about Social Security and Medicare. Of course, these were expensive programs. They're kind of unsustainable if you look even just a few years out. They're crowding out everything else in the budget. And they also crowded out private spending on savings and private insurance markets that might have been developed for retirees in the absence of these programs. Among the non-elderly population, really not much of a change in poverty until you get to the 1990s. And what happened in the 1990s? Robert has been talking about welfare reform. Kind of the first experimentation began at the states when President George H.W. Bush and President Clinton started allowing states to experiment more. We expanded the earned income tax credit, and then, of course, in 1996, there was the big federal reform. And after the early 1990s, poverty actually dropped quite a bit among kids and families with children. But there are also kind of two negative elements of what we did. The first, it's been really expensive fighting the war on poverty. We've spent something like $16 trillion since the mid-1960s, which is something like double what we spent on actual wars during this period. Today we spend per poor person, about 6.5 times what we spent in the late 1960s. At the federal level, we spend about $750 billion with a B dollars a year on means-tested programs. That doesn't include Social Security, it doesn't include Medicare, it doesn't include unemployment insurance, workers' comp. So we spend a lot of money, and we've put income in people's pockets, and we've reduced the poverty rate. But it's been expensive, and during that same period, upward mobility has basically been stagnant. And partly that's because I think certainly folks on the left tend to overstate the extent to which income and sort of having parental income is the way that you achieve mobility for kids. And so the fact that we actually were able to put money in people's pockets doesn't necessarily translate into more upward mobility. Second, as Robert and Brad, I think both were talking about, we may have actually introduced some really important perverse incentives in our anti-poverty policies, whether that's work disincentives, marriage disincentives, savings disincentives. And so that's, I think, the sense in which Reagan was right, that we didn't win the war on poverty ultimately, because we've kind of mechanically reduced the number of people who don't have much to get by on, but we've not ultimately improved intergenerational poverty in a sense. And so I think that's really where conservative insights have been extraordinarily beneficial since the 1990s, and I think that's why it's so important that conservatives do, as Robert said, get in the game and stay in the game, because I think what we've seen with our liberal anti-poverty policy is just there are some fundamental premises that have just shown to be not right, I think, by the 1996 reforms, and we can talk more about that as we go along.
Well, so on the both of you encouraging conservatives to jump into the game, I do want to take a step back because I see we've invoked Charles Murray, who calls himself a libertarian. I see some of my libertarian brethren in here. Gene Healy of the Cato Institute once told me that I was a libertarian from 9 to 5 and a conservative on the weekends, which is better than the alternative. Yeah, well, what is our duty to the poor, and why does that fall on the government, whether it's federal or state? Do we all have a duty to feed the hungry and house the homeless, or is that their fault? I know how you guys are going to answer on that, but if I do have that duty, why does that fall onto the government? Is it just because it already is falling onto the government and we should do it better, or is it inherently a governmental problem, and is it a federal problem?
I sort of deal with the cards on play. This is the situation we live in, and I do come a little bit from the political world, and a blue state too. So sure, if there was an ideal world that we could start over with, we might not have the extent of government involvement that we do, and we would start over in a fresh, different way. But we're not there. That's not where we are, and that's not where we are politically. So from my standpoint, I saw a lot of civic and community-based organizations that did great work to help people and did it in a way that was more effective than some government programs. But 40 years from FDR till now, or however many years it's been from FDR till now, I can't count. It's 60. We are way down the road, and we have to sort of deal with the world as it is. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a long-term conservative goal to devolve things towards the states. I think there's a lot to recommend that. I do think it's not practical to think that we're going to do it overnight or in the next 5 years or even the next 10 years. And I do think that there actually is a case that the left makes for federal involvement in the safety net that I think has some merit. The first is that poorer states are less able to support their poor than richer states are, and so there is an element of progressivity. It's sort of buried and it doesn't come to the forefront very much. But I think it's an important. I support a progressive income tax, so you can debate the extent of progressivity, and some people will reject it entirely. But I think that is one rationale for having the federal government be involved. Second is the business cycle. So a lot of states have to balance their budgets. The federal government doesn't. We've certainly erred too much on the side of deficit spending, for sure. But again, I think that's a reason for the federal government to at least be partly involved rather than just the states. And then I guess you could argue another reason for federal involvement would be to have sort of federalist experimentation. So if more of our programs did what we've done with the cash welfare program that used to be FDC and now is TANF, where we've kind of said to states, you're going to get a block grant. We'll give you, some restrictions about how you can spend it, but it'll be much less restrictive than what we used to do. Then you can sort of let 1,000 flowers bloom. You can figure out what works, what doesn't work. I'd like to see us head in that direction towards more experimentation, federally sponsored, but not necessarily federally directed, for instance, in early childhood education and things like that. But I think in the long run, as Robert said, if you're starting kind of from a blank slate, you might not choose to have so much of this be at the federal level.
I think we also have to recognize, too, that the market does some things very well, but not everything well. And I think that there's clearly ways in which the creative destruction attendant to the market can create dynamism, can create growth, but of course, in many contexts, can be devastating for individuals or for communities. One thinks, in my state, for instance, Virginia, where Southside Virginia has been really devastated by free trade, as many industries have lost out to China and other countries, in the free market. And so, given that reality, some no local group of churches, of United Way affiliates could, by any stretch of the imagination, take on the burden of helping, thousands and thousands of families that have seen, parents lose their jobs because of the free market, sort of move forward. So I think you have to be cognizant of the fact that the free market, does have some downsides, and there's a role, albeit a limited role, for the government to play in helping people who have been hurt by the vicissitudes of the market through no fault of their own, get back on their feet, support their families, and move forward.
Well,
Can I just add one more thing about this? Because this is when sometimes I hear about that line of hearing. I heard that from one of the senators from Texas at an event I was at a year ago. One thing that occurred to me was, well, let's start with the things that you benefit from. If we're going to start eliminating government's involvements in citizens' lives and government's investments, at least start with the things that benefit you and your family. And so let's start at middle class entitlements, or the various forms of government assistance that flow to more well-off people. Then let's do that first, and then we'll work down to the other things that involve struggling Americans.
I encourage looking at which government programs benefit the well-off and well-connected. But Brad, you referred to charity and its limited role, but you talk about I see a safety net. If you're not just talking about a government safety net, family, marriage, community, you talk about social capital, I think you use that phrase. Does that get eroded by government involvement? This is certainly a story conservatives tell, and I believe it because it matches up with all of my prior assumptions, that government involvement in the safety net erodes civil society institutions that A, can be a safety net, and B, have other benefits outside of the material alleviation of poverty.
Yeah, no, I think in certain contexts and with certain bad disincentives, it is the case the government can undercut, the power of the family and of civic institutions to provide solidarity to their members. And that's something that I think conservatives are particularly attentive to. But I'm just also saying we need to be attentive to ways in which the market can do just the same thing. That there are ways in which, when industries are collapsing or companies are collapsing, in the face of this dynamic, marketplace, that too can exact a real cost on the strength and integrity of families and civic institutions as well. So all I'm saying is that both the market and the state, in certain contexts, in certain ways, can pose challenges to the integrity and the health of the family and of civil society. And I think that we need to just be attentive to that and recognize that there's some role in which public policy can be a counter to some of the fallout the market can have on civic and family institutions.
Yeah, I think that's a really important consideration, and I think that's part of why a lot of what I write is to try to dispel misperceptions about sort of how the middle class is doing, for instance. So safety nets, aren't just for the poor, right? Unemployment insurance, is one of our major safety net programs that benefits a lot more people than just the poor. And I'll defend having a safety net, but I do also think we need to be careful about how we characterize the state of the middle class, for instance, and even the poor, because I think to the extent that we talk about things as though everyone is sort of just one bad break away from catastrophe and poverty, or if we talk about incomes being stagnant, when the Congressional Budget Office data shows that median incomes have risen by at least 40% since just 1979. So since 1969, it'd be quite a bit more than that. That tends to support, I think, a bigger government liberal perspective that, well, geez, we all need protection from the vicissitudes of the market out there. And I think that is a danger. Yuval Levin has this great quote from one of his national affairs essays, which is something like, we, meaning conservatives, we want to make the poor less dependent on government. We don't want to make the middle class more dependent on government. And I think that's a real danger to not focusing our safety net policies on a fairly small group of people who have the most need.
Yeah, and I always felt it was important to talk about increased dependency being a bad thing. We don't want people to be dependent on government. We'd rather they were self-sufficient. And to the extent that instead we talk about income transfers as poverty alleviation and all good with no bad, we're making a mistake. And they've definitely undermined work and undermined marriage.
Well, that I wanted to ask about both of those, especially about marriage, before Brad leaves. So let me ask that now. I get the idea that you imply through a lot of your writing that marriage helps people get out of poverty and et cetera. And the liberal response is always, no, it's poverty that keeps people from getting married. Those liberals that think marriage is a good thing, they say we need to get you out of poverty so that you can get married. And a similar argument, slightly different, comes from Tyler Cowen, which is most guys aren't really good and aren't worth marrying, and so the fall in marriage rate is just women, A, realizing that, and B, if they don't have a good income, then there's definitely no good reason to marry them. So, I mean, and I'll add a final thing to here. Again, I'm a libertarian Catholic. I kind of don't want government more in my marriage, and I don't necessarily want it more in other people's marriage. So that's my slew of marriage questions at you.
On the marriage and poverty issue, or the marriage and money issue, really, as we might frame it in a more broadly gauged way, it's important to acknowledge that I think both, in a sense, the left and the right have it right on this score, and that is that we know, for instance, that one reason that working class and poor families are marrying at much lower rates and getting divorced at much higher rates than their college-educated peers is that there is less stable income coming in the door for the men in those communities. So, so poverty, declining real wages are a real issue for men in many of our poor middle class communities, and that's part of the reason why marriage has hit a rough spot in those communities. So that's sort of on the left side. But it's also the case, as we've seen the work of Robert Lerman at the Urban Institute, and also George Akerlof, who is the husband, of course, of Janet Yellen, that when men get married, they tend to work harder, work more strategically, and make more money. So marriage does sort of boost men's motivation on average to be hardworking employees, and that redounds to the economic benefit of them and their wives and their kids. So that's consistent with kind of a more conservative take on things. Vis-a-vis Tyler Cowen's view, sort of the marriageability of men issue, I mean, it's a real issue, but I think it's also the case too, and this speaks just to my previous point, that if lots of men are not getting married, they have kind of less incentive, both sort of personally and socially, to kind of become more responsible, to become more mature. And so one reason few men seem like they're marriageable is because marriage has lost ground, in many communities, and for, of course, many 20-somethings in ways that make it easier for men to kind of just be goof-offs to some extent, and for some of them, not all. So that's how it's going. Now, in terms of the libertarian conservative or libertarian Catholic point, I do
Fulton
have...
Sheen wrote a book on marriage called 3 to Get Married, and I don't want that third one to be Barack Obama. Why do I want government helping marriages?
Well, what I've said today is that at the very least, public policy should not penalize marriage. And that's the reality for many of our means-tested policies. It actually ends up penalizing marriage. That, I think, is a real tragedy, given the fact that so many of our public policies in this arena touch so many Americans. So I would say at a minimum, we have to figure out ways to reduce or eliminate that marriage penalty. Now, in terms of a more positive programmatic agenda, we've seen Bush's Healthy Marriage Initiative try to achieve some ground on this front. And frankly, with the exception of Oklahoma, I don't think it did, much. So, I'm not convinced that the government really can do much in a kind of positive, programmatic social services way to strengthen marriage. But at the very least, it can stop penalizing economically marriage, in ways that make marriage a bad deal, at least from a short-term perspective, for many lower-income couples and lower-income families.
The other thing is the value of work, and I think this is a major division between the left and the right. That when conservatives talk about, well, we don't want to disincentivize people to work, that gets rejected. A lot of people just say, look, these people need a check. If they get a job, that's great, but they need a check. why is work so important? In the writings of all three of you guys, you say you need a job. Well, yeah, but isn't the point of a job to have a check? And so and I'll combine this with the marriage question, if you're staying at home raising a kid, does that woman really need a job? Doesn't she need a check and the ability to take care of her child? So I want from all three, starting with Brad, with the marriage angle, talking about the value of work in this whole debate.
Well, I think it really goes back to Robert's point, and it's a point about human dignity. And I think this is a point where, you know, the left and right should be on the same page here, right? That we can all see that part of being a human person and sort of enjoying our full dignity is to have the opportunity to work. And that may be in the home, raising kids, taking care of the home. It may be in the workplace. But then in those different arenas, having an opportunity to, you know, to engage in real labor and to see the fruits of your labor is a great thing. And to just accept the reality that there are going to be, you know, tons of people who have no connection to that real meaningful work, I think is a tragedy. You know, whether it has to be in the workplace or not is a different question. But I think we should all be able to agree that work itself is an intrinsic good, and that we should make that intrinsic good. And Arthur Brooks, of course, has talked about this, sort of the experience of earned success, something that is accessible to everyone, because not only does it engender or give income, but it also gives a sense of meaning and purpose and stability and direction to people's lives.
I would like to just add one thing about the marriage thing. In New York, we didn't talk about marriage, and we didn't talk so much about marriage benefits to the husband and wife, but we did talk about the benefits to children of being raised in households with two married parents, which is a little different, and sometimes we might not even say married, just to sort of make the language as acceptable to everybody as we could. But that, I think, is really the point for a lot of Americans that they do get, and that is children do better when they're raised by two parents who are actively involved in a positive way in their lives. And too many children are raised in households without that benefit. And if you keep saying that and saying that our government programs are contributing in an unintentional way, but contributing to that being a problem, and we at least talk about the downside effects to kids in a way that's open and honest, using data, I think that that's a government involvement that would be acceptable. And I agree with Brad that the programs that tried to encourage marriage, just the studies showed they didn't work as successfully as we had hoped. On work, I think that there's just an expectation in a household that that we want people to get up and have a engagement with the greater society involving themselves, and that they're earning success for themselves as opposed to being dependent on a government check. And I think there were a lot of studies after welfare reform that showed that all this going to work of young mothers did not have negative effects on the children, which some were worried about. And I think that's because in many respects that kind of household is more healthy for the child and for themselves than one that is just sort of sitting on the couch with a check and caring for the child.
I think that's right, and I think you know, this goes to the point about if we want to increase upward mobility, that income might not be the thing that you want to focus on. I think the left tends to believe that income in the form of a government check will be beneficial for kids. I think there is a little bit of a danger in conservatives in just saying, well, that income in the form of a paycheck is going to be all that matters. But work does more than just give you a paycheck. It potentially gives kids sort of different role modeling in kids that live in concentrated poverty in areas where a lot of adults in the community receive safety net benefits. It potentially can have a much bigger transformative effect if everyone can sort of be induced into this kind of culture of work, I think. The other thing about work and marriage, where I think it is really important to pay attention to this conservative insight of perverse incentives, about the marriageable men idea that the guys out there just aren't worth marrying. Charles Murray, we'll invoke him again, has this really interesting point in his last book that says, essentially, if the story about guys declining paychecks for less skilled men was the cause of the explosion in out-of-wedlock birth, it's a weird story in some ways, right? Because, so essentially what that story says is that it became more difficult to support to have a two-parent family that made enough to have kids, and so the way women responded was to just not get married and still have the kids. Economically, that's not a story that makes a ton of sense, except that we do have a safety net that while not allowing people to live sort of high off the hog, does provide a baseline level of support that has proven to be enough to support single-parent families. And so potentially that is one reason why we've got a lot more out-of-wedlock births than we might have had. And then even take it one step further. If I'm a guy with few skills, I'm not expected anymore to be careful about who I date and what I do when I date. And I'm not expected to marry the mother of my child. That causes a whole nother set of cultural shifts that then affect male labor force participation rates. So I think this is a place where some of the perverse incentives in our safety net policies really have contributed to the problem, and that's something that we've got to be really attuned to as we experiment with different reforms.
My problem with that discussion about the perverse incentives is, I mean, it's hard to imagine an individual going through the thought process you just described. I wouldn't do it. Is it because the poor people are worse at math and they think, well, yes, being a single mom actually turns out to be a great deal, or maybe they're not reading enough of the fine print about the welfare. If it hurts them from our perspective, but you're saying that because it sort of mitigates the cost of it, that it's more likely to happen on any individual level. That seems like an implausible story. But is there data that you guys have looked at that on the macro level that it does have that effect?
Well, I think that it's the irony here is that I'm being hit from the right by Scott Winship today, which is fun. But I think we need to think about this not just in kind of a narrow economic lens, but just sort of think about the broader social and cultural meaning of work for men that persists even today. And I think the point I would make is that I think when men are not stably employed, both in their own eyes and the eyes of their partners or their wives, they take a hit. And that can cause a kind of a friction or an insecurity or instability that's associated with less marriage in the first place and more divorce in the second place. So I mean, I take Charles Murray's point there, but I think it's also about sort of what is the meaning of work for men as potential breadwinners, potential husbands, or as currently being husbands. And when they lose access to that stable, decent paying work, that can exact a psychic and sort of social cost, both for them and for their partners, that may be associated with less marriage, independent of whether or not there are government benefits that might, kind of stand in the gap for them. So I do think that there is something beyond just the economic story here that's worth thinking about in terms of the shift in men's labor force participation here that could be consequential. And on that note, I need to fly.
Thank you, Brad. Because Brad has to leave, why don't we give him a round of applause? Thank you. There's a point in Plato dialogue where Socrates says, don't trust the people who say they'll make you wise but are going to charge you money for it. They're all the sophists. And so I remember discussing this freshman seminar at St. John's, and one kid said, well, excuse me, aren't we paying our professor, we call them tutors, aren't we paying them for this? And the tutor, Miss Blitz was her name, said, Mr. Halber, I do not get paid to read or discuss Plato. I get paid to go to faculty meetings. And that, unfortunately, is what Brad Wilcox is doing here. I have one more sort of general question for these guys before I start taking questions from all you. We talked about paternalism a little bit. And again, as a conservative and libertarian, I don't like this. I mean, they tell me what kind of light bulbs I can have. They tell me how to raise my kids, when I have to keep them in a car seat until after they pass their road test, basically. The government telling me to do all these things I don't really like. And the left actually doesn't like the paternalism involved with the welfare. There's always, I have a friend, Arthur Delaney at the Huffington Post, who always has a daily feature called Conservatives Making Poor People Pee in Cups, of a new state or county that's, the means testing for the welfare benefits involves drug testing. That seems demeaning to me, just like liberal paternalism seems to me. So why are we all okay with that here?
Well, I was okay with it because they were coming to government for assistance, and they were asking the taxpayers and the government agency to provide cash assistance, a check every month, medical care, access to a job program, food stamp benefits. To me, that broke the bounds of the sort of libertarian ideal. I'm sympathetic with you if you don't receive public assistance in any way, and you don't want to be told what to do, and you don't want your government spending money telling you what to do. I can understand that. But when it comes to the receipt of public assistance, I think we have to be engaged in setting standards and setting expectations for people, because the other way, I think, doesn't work successfully in getting people to move up or move into employment.
How do you determine sort of what sort of standards to do? I mean, you could imagine
Well, I'll give you-
Mayor Bloomberg saying, you know what, we're going to make sure you're not buying soda.
Well,
Or
in,
drug
in the,
testing,
in the
or-
case of, well, there are two examples. Well, we didn't do drug testing. We did require you to go to a assessment of your potential dependence on alcohol or substance abuse, and if you were assessed to be someone who had a problem, we asked you to go to a place to get care, and if you didn't, we cut your benefit. We asked you to go tomorrow to a company that helps people get jobs, sometimes very low-wage jobs, sometimes the pizza parlor at McDonald's, but that company will help you get that job, and you need to be there tomorrow. And if that company tells us tomorrow you're not there, we're going to cut your benefit. So that was the way. Those were the expectations of the normal expectation of a person engaged in society. And on the food, the mayor did decide, along with the health department and my agency, to ask the federal government to allow us to not allow people to use food stamp benefits to buy sugary and sweetened beverages. And that was a way in which we were trying to say, why should the food stamp program, which is now called the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, why should we be paying in New York City hundreds of millions of dollars for a product that has no nutritional value whatsoever and is actually bad for you? So we wanted to do that. The Obama administration said no. Now, do I agree with the mayor saying that the movie stores can't sell the Big Gulp? Well, I'll leave that for another day, but that's a different issue. But it has to do with the relationship.
Just on the cultural message that Brad was bringing up, are you really helping people sort of on the road to independence if you're still micromanaging their life? I hate that Bloomberg told me not to drink big sodas, but yet we're going to say, okay, Carney gets to drink his sodas, but we're going to treat you differently. And doesn't that make somebody feel like a second-class citizen? And couldn't it have the same effects as discouraging work or anything like that?
Well, the receipt of assistance opens the dialogue. I mean, they've agreed to come in and seek government assistance and ask for the government to provide for their livelihood. Once that happens, it seems to me the door is open to directing their behavior.
All right, questions from the audience. We have microphones going around. Please wait till the microphone gets to you and identify yourself, and please try to make the question as brief as possible so we can get in as many as possible.
Thank you very much. It's been very good discussion. My name is Lou Enoff, and I wanted to ask a question about poverty among the aged. You haven't talked about that. And the poor aged tend to be women. I have a proposal to make earnings sharing under Social Security, to put that into effect. It's been done in a few countries where a couple, when they're married, they combine their earnings, they pay Social Security tax on the combined amount, and then they split that during married life. I think it would have a big effect. Now, I'm getting some feedback from some of my conservative colleagues who are saying it's a disincentive to marriage. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, because I've been trying to think of ways of alleviating the disincentive. And
because once I get married, I can imagine that I'll get a smaller return on my Social Security because my wife will get. Okay. Either of you thought of this?
That's not something that I'm familiar with, so I can't really comment on it. I will say that one of the things that happened in the poverty measure debate was that one of the sort of generally accepted principles of the war on poverty is that the transformation of Social Security and other Medicare greatly alleviated poverty among senior citizens significantly. But then when they shifted the measure to be more relative and also to take into account all the transfers, and they raised the threshold, more seniors appeared to be poor, and that raised a political issue. Well, now we've got to address that. And that this is that maybe not what you want to hear, but I'm concerned about that, because the extent to which our programs, our federal deficit is in some way driven by the enormous amount of assistance we provide to people over 65, and that makes it less dollars available for other things. I would be concerned about a sort of resurging interest in investing more assistance on programs for seniors. If it pays for itself, well, that's a different matter.
All right, let's go, lady in the hat right up here in front. Mike is coming from behind you.
Hi, thank you. When you were talking about poverty, I may have missed it, but I thought I did not hear you make a distinction between what I think of as a safety net, which is someone walking on a high wire. They're employed, they're supporting their families or their child if they're not in fact married, and something happens. And they fall off the wire and boom, up and down the safety net until they can get their act together and back on the wire again. That seems to me, however, very different, both psychologically and also functionally, and in terms of a policy response, very different from the structural poverty, which is multi-generational, in which there are generations that have never held a job in the first place. And the reason I'm asking the question is, first of all, would you please make a distinction in response to my question about, are there policy differences? And secondly, I think that when you talk about why conservatives tend not to talk about this a lot, is that it's charitable to help somebody get up on their feet after they've stumbled, but nobody actually wants to be supporting a family of strangers at the point of a gun. And I'm saying this out loud, even though it sounds awful, because I think that that underlies much of the refusal to actually sort of go there. So could you answer my first question?
Those are very good points. And can I just say something about that? Because one of the most significant changes to the welfare policies in TANF legislation was that there was a time limit, that the government had clearly gotten fed up with providing year after year after year after assistance to folks who were not transitioning off of welfare. And I thought it was terrific in New York, because we finally had a limit on how much we could provide assistance, and it was 5 years of federally provided assistance. And it was a very good message to send to the people who are receiving benefits that we are providing temporary assistance. And along that way, we changed the name of our agency from the Department of Social Services to the Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance. So I think that's a very good point. And as we look at reforms, for instance, like the ones being proposed by Chairman Ryan, I think there is an interest in applying that time-limited nature of assistance to other forms of assistance like food stamp benefits. And I think that's a very good point. The time limit aspect in welfare policy is underappreciated, how important it was in getting people to face up to that they needed to address their own issues as much as government needed to help them.
And I think it's also worth emphasizing, which you're right, I don't think we did, that the safety net acts for many, many people as a temporary safety net. You know, you lose a job, maybe you get divorced, and you're a woman and you've not worked while you were married, and now you're trying to figure out a whole new life. For a lot of people, the safety net works. You know, they're on it for a few months, and they're off. I think all of the policy energy and all of the policy discussion tends to be around this group of kind of harder cases that have been on for years, where there is multi-generational receipt. There's also a third group, I would say, of people who just have one of any number of real barriers to work. And that might be anything from being a new mom who has an infant. You know, we're not expecting, I don't think anybody expects to sort of send them out into the workforce within 6 months of delivering necessarily. It can range from people who have kind of drug or alcohol problems that we could help better than we do now. And there are just some people who have, real cognitive, behavioral barriers that are just not going to be employable. And so we're always going to need some sort of safety net for that group, which I think is a small part of most caseloads. Right now, we have this makeshift way that we take care of a lot of these families, which is that we sort of shift them into the SSI program, which historically has been a program for families with really severely physically and mentally disabled kids to help cover the additional costs of taking care of those kids. Increasingly, it's become a program that serves kids who have sort of gray learning disabilities, ADHD, and everyone has benefits to move people onto this program because the states don't cover the costs of it, so it's entirely federally funded, and there aren't time limits. Those kids we're really not serving very well, and in some ways we've got to figure out, I think, a better policy for dealing with really hard to employ people with tons of barriers, but in a way that doesn't hurt their kids' mobility. A lot of those kids go right into adult SSI when they turn 18, never actually get a job.
Yeah, I think that the disability and Social Security programs are where this sort of lifetime dependency is the most serious. Cash assistance does have a time limit. Food stamp benefits, people come off and on and off them. Unemployment insurance, it was frustrating. It kept getting extended and extended. It was supposed to be a temporary form of assistance. The one I would be very worried about is health insurance, government-funded health coverage, because I think there are going to be increasing number of people that for all their life they're going to have government-provided health care coverage, and that's going to make the safety net costs look as big as they look.
And I think this is a good sort of left versus right divide. When you talk about dependency, that's not a word you ever hear Barack Obama using. They think it's good. Like the Life of Julia, wasn't that about them saying, look how good it is that you can get subsidies your whole life for this regular middle class woman, and you don't need any family, you don't need a husband to have your kid, you don't need parents, you don't need neighbors. And so when you talk about getting the Obamacare tax credits for your whole life, that seems like a win, because now this guy was able to keep a job that makes him happy. He doesn't have to work 40 hours a week, work 30 hours a week, get by, get the tax credit, and that's a good thing. You think that's a bad thing? I mean, is there any headway to make in this? You're from a blue state and a blue city.
Well, I have often said that I thought that the healthcare costs of the safety net are different. I mean, there's no work test in Medicaid. There's no time limit, and their costs are ridiculously high, that there needed to be reform there. We didn't get that with Obamacare, but that doesn't mean, Scott and I we're willing to defend some aspects of the safety net, but don't put the whole thing on us.
I mean, I was asking you because you were in New York, and
Oh, yeah.
Scott, you're from Brookings. I mean, are
Yeah.
you both
No, he's
have
not
been
from Brookings.
Yeah, Maine? Yeah,
Yeah.
you both have been there. Is there an understanding on the left, you think, that where headway could be made, that dependency is a real thing, and that people?
Not when it comes to healthcare. They believe that they view that as a government. They view it like Social Security assistance for seniors. I mean, people get Social Security assistance from 65 till 90.
Yeah, so it would be like saying that we're dependent on our government for defense, is how that sounds to them. All right, more questions. In the back, sir.
Hi, I'm Michael Hendricks from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. Can you talk more about what a uniquely conservative response would be when poverty takes on a distinctively middle-skilled or middle-class face, whether that is from those who've been scarred by long-term unemployment, or over the longer term, what folks like Tyler Cowen and Andrew McAfee have written about, the rise of robotics and how that maybe potentially impacts those who are middle-skilled over the long term and helps or may push them away from good, solid work for a long time.
You go first, Scott.
I mean, my first reaction is to downplay a little bit the threat to middle class workers. I'm very bullish on robots. if robots reduce demand by 25%, it's only going to be because things are 25% cheaper than they were. Maybe rather than unemployment going up by 25%, we'll all just work 25% less, or our careers will be 25% shorter. That said, I think there are ways we could reform the unemployment insurance program that reduce the incentives for staying on longer, and that help encourage people to get new skills early on in their spell. I think the George W. Bush administration had some really interesting ideas around unemployment insurance reform. Otherwise, I think really we've just got to. I'm a big fan of the federal government kind of sponsoring vehicles for self-insurance. So, maybe we make it easier for people to have the equivalent of a 401k, or make it easier to tap into a 401k, for loans, which you can currently do. But that sort of thing where you actually are. I think we need to encourage people to internalize the costs of different risks that they might face. And so if people want to self-insure, we should provide a bunch of ways for people to self-insure. But I don't think we ought to increase unemployment insurance spending by X% or create new programs. And I don't think robotics is going to. I think it's going to be far more beneficial for especially the middle class than harmful.
I also don't think the answer is to raise the eligibility numbers and bring all the middle class into the safety net programs. And I've always thought that the most important tenet of Mayor Bloomberg's efforts in the city was that he was constantly focused on the economy, and he viewed decisions on taxes and development and economic and regulation through the eyes of someone who cared about people who needed jobs more than anything else. And so the fact that our recovery is so weak has been very, very harmful to poor and middle class Americans. I don't think the answer is more government dependency. I think it's a stronger, better economy, and I'm not willing to concede that there's some structural thing going on that's going to make it terrible for the next 10 years.
I like that idea. Just have 4% economic growth every year, and then we don't have to worry about half this stuff. That's a great one. All right, more questions. Right over here on the other side of the pillar there.
I'm Lauren Pescatori. I'm with Tax Credit for Working Families. And I think out of all the safety net programs, there's been a good deal of bipartisan consensus around the earned income tax credit. I mean, I know we had Paul Ryan here a couple weeks ago talking about his plan. Scott, you wrote a little bit in your Room to Grow piece about Marco Rubio's idea for something similar to an EITC, but I didn't hear a lot of talk about it today, and I was just wondering, do you think that that's a smart platform for conservatives to be running on? And do you see any hope for bipartisan consensus and bipartisan agreement around particularly how to fund the credit?
Well, the expansion of the earned income tax credit to single individuals is an idea that has been around for some time and had not really gained any traction until the last couple of years. And the big news to me was that people like Senator Rubio and Congressman Ryan stepped forward to say it was something that they were very interested in pursuing. And I do think that a tax credit that supplements low-wage work for low-wage workers is a good thing. What I'm worried about is that it's not very well targeted if it goes to all childless adults between a certain age group who work to such an extent that their earnings are below a certain amount. Because some of those people may be working below a certain amount because they choose to, because they're at a different time in their lives. They're not the people who I think are most in need of an earnings supplement, who are young, mostly men in poor communities who are really struggling, and who the women in their lives who have children get a much bigger subsidy, and they get very, very little. So the cost is big. A childless adult expansion is a huge expansion. If they do it for everybody, it's a very big cost, and the EITC has a history of having an abuse problem, a waste problem. So I think that going forward, it's great that we're all talking about it. It's good that they're willing to there's an opportunity for consensus, but I think it's going to have to be targeted and tailored a little in order to be successfully passed.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the issue, much like your question, things that we didn't cover. I mean, the success of welfare reform in a lot of ways wasn't just, it certainly, part of it was the time limits and the block granting and the state flexibility, but a big part of it was, in addition to sort of whatever sticks that we use, we also had a lot of carrots. Earned income tax credit was greatly expanded during the Clinton administration. And for a while was the biggest anti-poverty program we had. I think Medicaid and actually food stamps now, or SNAP, are bigger than it. But doing both, kind of having the penalties if you don't behave in ways that further your independence, but also making work pay was the big Clinton slogan. Both of those are important pieces of safety net reforms, I think, and I do hope it can continue to be supported on a bipartisan basis.
Some people on the right don't necessarily trust bureaucrats to target as much as you do, or just like the problem with the bureaucracy isn't necessarily the bureaucrat's salary, but just the inefficiency that's created, and that it might not be as effective as, say, giving them money. So, and Milton Friedman, lots of people on the right talked about this. Shouldn't there just be a guaranteed basic income, and that can replace all safety net programs?
Yeah, when I came here, Carlin Bowman, who was here as an AEI scholar, gave me a big file of AEI documents, and it was full of these policy memorandums back and forth. And the thing I focused most on was this debate about that very subject, the minimum income and versus a sort of work-based welfare policy. And it looked to me, based on how I read it, it was a debate between Nixon, who took the Milton Friedman view, and Ronald Reagan, who took the no, workfare. We're going to have expectations and relationships. And President Reagan won that debate, and I think the American people would go with President Reagan on that again. So my personal view is that while you may not trust us and you may prefer to just give people money and wash your hands and eliminate all those bureaucrats, that's not the kind of situation I think most Americans would accept.
And it goes back to the issue of perverse incentives. I think if everyone got a basic minimum income, a lot would depend on what the level was, but that's a work disincentive. Maybe we want to do that and sort of restructure society based on that and that sort of incentive structure, but it's potentially a very big deal. The earned income tax credit, while it does have these administrative issues and there is a lot of fraud, it's basically a guaranteed minimum income for people who work, and so that's I think it avoids some of these perverse incentive problems.
Yeah, I'll go to I'm just going to make a comment and then take another question. Sometimes work disincentives, though, strike me as not the worst thing in the world. Again, if it's a single mom, a widow, and you make it easier for her to not work, that might be a good thing. Or somebody a single dad going from 40 hours down to 25 hours, because Obamacare subsidies do this. And work disincentives, I think, in the aggregate are bad, but there are cases where it's good. And so if Robert can come up with a good enough targeting apparatus, maybe we can do it. All right. So in the very back there.
Thank you. Lloyd Solis, University of Baltimore. Every now and then we hear news like cities going bankrupt, like Detroit, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Stockton, California, and how many more are coming in the coming years. So how do you address, in your most conservative estimate, when are we going to see light at the end of the tunnel concerning our economic alleviation in the coming years? In your most conservative estimate, like say in 5 years from now or 10 years from now?
You're tying the municipal bankruptcies just to general aftershocks of the financial crisis.
Yeah, on the national scale.
So yeah, so the financial crisis, if you look at Wall Street, we're better, right? there's a lot of ways in which we're not. Certainly the municipal bankruptcies are aftershocks. Employment, I think, is still lagging, isn't it? And then a lot of the Tyler Cowen argument that you guys don't seem to necessarily buy into is that for low-skilled, middle-income workers, the jobs didn't bounce back.
Well, first of all, for low-skilled workers, the jobs bounce back, and again, I hate to mention it again, maybe it's because New York City got all the benefits of the bailout, but there's plenty of low-skilled jobs in New York City, and I generally think that there are entry points in employment in most places that can be found. I am as frustrated by this question as you are. One of the most interesting things that I've noticed lately, in previous recessions, in the period during the recovery, there's always a lag on public assistance receipt. So, for instance, SNAP or food stamp benefits, the economy gets better, unemployment drops, and then after a little bit, food stamp starts to drop and it comes down. This recession, the economy's gotten better. We're we're 4 years from the recovery, and food stamps caseloads kept growing. And now they're ticking down a little, but it's very late, and the lag has taken much longer than it used to. And I think there's a lot of debate about whether that's because the economy is still so weak, or whether it's because the infusion of assistance to people in the wake of the recession by the Obama administration was so generous that the work and disincentives have slowed people's returning to the workforce. I'm increasingly more thinking that it's the second, not the first. But because I've never seen we'd be this far into recovery and an unemployment at this rate and food stamp rate still be very close to all-time records.
All right, more questions. Yeah, let's go up front here.
Brad talked about the three components of the American dream: work, marriage, and education. Could you talk a little bit about how education plays into the safety net?
Yeah, it's a very, very broad, tough question. I mean, I think it's clearly the case that having a college degree is not going to become less important anytime soon, right? And so clearly, if we want to just reduce the poverty rate before we take any safety net programs into account, then I think moving more people into and through college has got to be a big priority. I don't think we've got great ideas about how to do that. The college dropout rate is 50%. I think it's worse than that in community colleges. So I think you've got this problem where a bunch of people are coming into college without adequate skills. The cost of college gets all the attention. I think we pay a little bit too much attention to that. I think that we could certainly reform some of the student loan programs, which are probably subsidizing inflation in universities and colleges. But I think this greater problem is just preparedness and sort of how we continue to move people over that hump. When earlier in the 20th century we kind of moved sort of the easiest cases through college, right? The first people to get college degrees in some ways were the best prepared, and now we want to continue raising that college graduation rate, but we're kind of working with more and more marginally prepared students, I think. The Room to Grow policy book has a great chapter on higher ed by AEI's own Andrew Kelly, I think. And he talks a lot about different forms of accreditation. This is also in the Paul Ryan opportunity proposal. Just developing more institutions that are alternatives to a four-year college degree, I think ought to also be a big part.
I mean, more training for trades.
Yeah, for trades, for distance learning, for
Yep.
MOOCs, massive online. I always forget the acronym.
I recommend to you, I don't normally do this, but I recommend to you the New York Times Magazine article that's coming out on Sunday, or it's out on the web now, about Eva Moskowitz and charter schools in New York City. K through 12 is where we focused in New York City mostly. Charter schools, I think, are not perfect, but there are, at least in Eva's network of schools, there seems to be indications that great progress can be made. but it's just such a radical departure from the way in which public education is run, and the forces on the other side are so strong that I have always been, wanted it and urged it and hoped for it, but it's a really hard battle. And so sometimes I do think that people think that well, if we could just make better schools, we could solve this problem. And that problem, for instance, is caused by so many children being raised in single-parent families. And I think that's hopeful. It seems to be that this charter school network in New York is making progress there, but that's a really big challenge.
All right, over there against the wall.
Sam Pfister with the Mercatus Center. I was wondering if you could talk about how SSDI is contributing to poverty in the United States. There seems to be a trend of people moving from unemployment to SSDI. Once you're on SSDI, you qualify for Medicare and Medicaid. You can be on it until you're officially able to get on Social Security.
What it's
So
mostly
SSDI is Social Security Disability Insurance.
right, and I think that there's it's particularly a problem among men and men over 40 is my understanding, in that the eligibility criteria can be manipulated or exists, that allows folks who maybe still could work to not work and receive disability assistance. There's a big work disincentive. In fact, you're not allowed to work, and I don't know that the benefit levels really get you much above the poverty level. That is in effect a minimum level of income, and it has no work.
But if the benefit levels are that poor, why would it trap anybody? In other words, if I'm barely living at poverty and I can work, wouldn't I get a job?
Well, if you're on disability, you're not allowed to work, or you lose the benefit.
But I'd rather have, if my pay is going to be any above this poor thing. I mean, I thought the things that disincentivize you from work were when the benefits were approaching the value of work.
So I think you have to take into account a number of things. One is that there are also costs of working, whether those are transportation costs or work clothes, things like that. There's also just the fact that a lot of people do work off the books, even when they get benefits. I think the best evidence for this in the context of cash assistance for families with kids was by Kathy Eden, who won the trust of all these families in Chicago and later some other cities. So for a long time, she would ask them, like, how do you guys make ends meet? Well, like, I've added it up and it's impossible to get by on this amount. And eventually she got them to say, well, a bunch of people actually do work off the books. Some of them get money from the fathers of their kids. Some of them are in the underground economy doing things like selling drugs or prostitution even. For guys, I think there is a fair amount of off-the-books work. There are a lot of guys who I think, can sort of spend a few months, living with their mom, a few months living with a girlfriend, and sort of patch together a way to get by that way. Certainly no one is living, well, but when the alternatives are kind of a very low-paying job that may have actually been physically difficult, the equation, I think, changes a little bit. But.
And I'm going to take up the last question here because you just reminded me of it. They're not living well. Isn't the whole, remember Reagan used to talk about the welfare queens driving the Cadillacs? Isn't a lot, so my last question for both of you is just going to be on conservative attitudes to it. So while I'm from Greenwich Village too, so we all have been acquainted with the left. We live and work on the right now. And I find that a lot of conservatives just don't like the idea of them working all day and helping somebody who's not working. And there is this idea that if you're living on welfare, you're driving Cadillacs and you're doing well. Is that conservative idea, is that crazy? Is it true? Is it changing? What are you doing about it? Can conservatives be brought to want to save the safety net?
Again, if it's to help someone who is not working, conservatives, I think rightly, particularly if they have no reason not to be working, rightly object to that. And when they do, they're talking the language that most Americans can understand and appreciate. Now, when conservatives act as if that's the case for everybody who's poor, and they're driving Cadillacs, sometimes that language can get a little bit out of control. But the extent to which our programs support people that are either working or expected to work and are pushed into work, I think our language is fine. But conservatives have a right to object and should object to government benefit programs that are provided to people with no questions asked and allow people to live any way they want.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to why if you call it paternalism or whatever, is so important. I mean, I think without making demands on people who are receiving more in benefits than they are sort of paying in taxes, then support for the whole thing just falls apart entirely, I think. I do think it's important, I think Robert mentioned this in his opening remarks, that conservatives who do support a safety net of some sort do kind of change their language, and I think we're seeing that. But I think you're absolutely right. Between the sort of 47% comments during the campaign, we got a tweet during this event where someone's, the tweet from AEI was, how can conservatives save the safety net? And someone said, screw the safety net and everyone in it. That's sort of unhelpful politically. I hope even people who don't
believe that know that.
Right. But I think, also conservatives, ought to be in favor of helping people and giving them a hand up. People don't pick their parents. They don't pick their genes. There's a lot of inequality between siblings who grow up together. We ought to at least...
Very evident in my family, by the way.
What's that?
The inequality and natural ability among siblings.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of ways in which where we end up, really, there is an element of moral arbitrariness to it. And so we need to support a safety net. It ought to reflect conservative principles that Robert said. I think that's where the compromise is.
All right, I think there's lots to talk about. I think this is a great discussion. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Robert and Scott.
No, that was just sort of a